Hello, I'm George Liston, CA. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Whatever other definitions can be given to it, one thing is clear. This is already the century of global mobility. The numbers of individuals taking up residence in countries other than those of their birth grows enormously each year. And they are literally changing the faces of the societies to which they immigrate. Their overall effect is something like that of dynamic new actors entering a play in progress, changing the direction of the drama on stage and making new creativity possible. They might also be seen as a form of investment in the future, with wise societies seeing the newcomers as a sort of diversity capital, allowing their hosts to abandon gated mentalities for the gateway ideal of sophisticated, multicultural urban societies. My guest is Blair Ruble, author of Creating Diversity Capital, Transnational Migrants in Montreal, Washington, and Kiev. Blair Ruble, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you.
Blair, this book comes out at one of the most timely moments I can imagine, right at the height of the immigration controversy in our own country. And it reflects, and I think we go here to the central argument of it, your, I think, very, very sound contention that many cities now are faced with what places like New York and Amsterdam have long been challenged with, that is bringing diverse communities together. In the case of New York and Amsterdam, they've done it so well that they've been, through what we might call pragmatic pluralism, able to blend these multicultural societies. Is it your sense, Blair, that a great range, new range of cities now is going to be faced with this same challenge and they've got to get about this pretty quickly?
Well, I think one of the principles that emerged in New York very early on, but it's in places like Toronto and Amsterdam, is that there's no choice. People are here. They may not be like us, but somehow we have to figure out a way of making this work because no one's going away. And I think that we now see migrants around the world coming to cities that don't really have a long experience, particularly international migration. And there's a sense that, well, maybe this is temporary, maybe this isn't for the long run. People are disoriented when they think of their city as being English-speaking or Russian-speaking or French-speaking, and suddenly it's something else. And it's a real challenge. It's a challenge because it disrupts everyone's understanding of what their place is, what their home is.
Is the message in what you just said, Blair, that it's a mistake to think of this as kind of a short-term phenomenon? This is not going to go away. It's going to increase. And if it is to increase, then what is the precise meaning of diversity capital? I mean, how is a city to look at that?
Well, the contention of the book is that migrants and migration, these are phenomena that are here to stay. They're part of 21st century life. In fact, I think you can make an argument that people have been moving since the beginning of human existence on this planet. But we seem in the 1980s and 1990s, for a variety of reasons, to enter a new period. And it's affecting places that have never thought of themselves as being affected. And in that sense, it's a new phenomena, and I would argue a kind of permanent phenomena. By diversity capital, I really mean the repertoire of responses to diversity. And what I'm trying to argue is that that repertoire can expand or it can contract, and that if this is a new reality, we need to figure out ways of making it expand. In other words,
that repertoire of responses, that is how the cities in question respond to this.
Well, this is looking very specifically at cities, because I think cities are critical focal points in this. But it's not only public policy, and it's not just legislation, it's really changes in norms of behavior. It's changes perhaps in language use, it's changes more fundamentally in how people interact with one another.
I agree with that, because having read the book, I was struck by that, and my shorthand was that these are changes that are as much psychic as physical.
I think that it's really coming to accept the fact that whoever was there, quote unquote, first, is sharing this space with somebody who's different. And that can be reflected in policy, it can be reflected in law, but it also can be reflected in what happens in a store.
Exactly, in the street and everyday life. Why these three cities, Blair? Why Montreal, Washington, and Kiev?
Well, I came at this in a way through the back door, because I started out in Kiev, and it was unexpected. I'm a Russian specialist. I was in Kiev with a colleague who was a Ukrainian specialist, and my colleague Nancy Popson was visiting elementary schools and found schools where virtually none of the children were native-born Ukrainians. And so that sort of led to a series of questions. But what I came to understand as I was looking at Kiev is that there's a special problem for cities that have been traditionally divided by race, by religion, by language, and that there maybe the problems are more acute. Whatever unhappiness one can find in the history of a New York or Toronto or Amsterdam, and there certainly are bad moments, it fits into a broader context where the idea that everybody's from someplace else is kind of accepted. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, you have largely homogeneous cities who are now dealing with the presence of migrants. But these are very particular kinds of cities where there were deep divisions.
Right.
And part of the argument is that the arrival of migrants is expanding the repertoire of dealing with diversity because they don't fit into the old storylines.
You, in that answer, Blair, emphasized the role of history, the history that experienced by the countries and by the cities in question as these new immigrants come in and essentially change the equation. And I want to go with you, as the book does, city by city, to get at least a brief sense of how that history does influence things. One quick question before we do that. Is it your sense, Blair, that you could just as easily have expanded this book, or in a second volume perhaps, treated cities in, let's say, Japan, Belgium, Philippines? In other words, is this worldwide?
I think, in general, the necessity of trying to figure out how to make diversity work is a worldwide problem. And I think there are cities like this. One could point to even a city like Osaka, Japan, which is historically divided between a Korean population, a Japanese population, or Brussels or Barcelona. I think that this is one type of city, but I think the problem actually, the challenge goes beyond this particular kind of city.
The book does a very good job, I think, Blair, of depicting the economic and social transformation and the political transformations that come into place as these immigrants arrive in these cities. But as I said a moment ago, it's the history that really is what sets the context. Turning first of all in that regard to Montreal, I was struck by, and as a very, very novelistic, I thought, presentation, very effective, of a young Pierre Elliott Trudeau in Canada, 1968, kind of the height of Canada's own great turmoil over its identity. That is to say, the issue of Quebec independence. Quebec is kind of trying to decide its fortunes within Canada, and the city of Montreal itself trying to define what kind of city it is. And it's at this precise moment, I think, that we began to get the first early waves of immigration into Canada. Is that correct?
Well, there had been obviously immigration into Canada for a long time, but Canada, like the United States, changed its immigration laws in the late 1960s, mid to late 1960s. So what you began to get was a new kind of immigrant, and you began to get immigrants not from Europe or North America, but from the Middle East, from Asia, from Latin America. And so literally the complexion of migration was changing. And that was exactly at the moment that the battle lines over Quebec separatism were becoming most tightly drawn. And Montreal it has never attracted the number of immigrants as Toronto or even Vancouver, but it still was attracting large numbers of immigrants, larger numbers of different kinds of people who are arriving just at the moment that there's a real division developing over what it means to be
Quebecois.
Quebecois.
I want to ask how the dramatic question is how they affect the answer to that question. One other thing occurred to me, Blair. Was their arrival largely a process of invitation? Was Canada aggressive in seeking immigration, more so than the other cities we're talking about?
Canada probably was more aggressive. And what happens in Montreal, because of the concern of Francophones over the loss of French, is that at a certain point there's a transformation from immigrants being seen as part of the problem, diluting the French character of Montreal and Quebec, to being part of the solution, because after all, you can have immigrants who are already French-speaking. And that's a change that also takes place during this period, so that you have Quebec governments, both liberal and sovereigntist, Parti Québécois governments, trying to recruit a certain kind of immigrant, a French-speaking immigrant.
What effect does their immediate arrival have on the political question that you mentioned a moment ago, that is to say the Quebec independence issue, which I think was undergoing some referendums at the point that they began to come en masse.
The first referendum took place about the time when they were beginning to arrive, but the effects really come a little bit further down the road in the 1990s, and Montreal in general and the Anglophone, what was left of the Anglophone community, and the so-called allophones, who are the immigrants, really defeat separatism in the mid-1990s, much to the chagrin of many Quebecois, political leaders in Quebecois.
That in itself is stunning. I think it's also true from this book, Blair, that they also literally changed the face of Montreal and its relation to the suburbs that surround it.
Absolutely, and what you begin to see happening, particularly after the defeat in the last referendum, is a realization among Quebec politicians that suddenly there are different voters out there too.
Right.
And you begin to see people from a pro-sovereignty position, the so-called separatists, and also from the federal position trying to embrace these communities. Now there's another part of the story here that is very important, and for Americans and for many English Canadians, it deals with the inappropriate use of government force, but there was a law which required essentially the immigrants to send their children to French language schools. And looking back at it, what that has produced, whether or not one believes it was an appropriate measure or not, what it has produced is a society where there are a very large number of trilingual people.
Exactly.
And what that did in Montreal, and I think Montreal is the best case of what I'm trying to describe, it took some of the toxins out of the language issue, because everybody at the end of the day spoke French, English, and in many cases another language, and it made the challenge of language a little bit different.
A little bit less divisive than it had been. Well, speaking of division, maybe we can turn to our next city now, and that's Washington, where this history that affected the immigrants as they began to arrive en masse in the late 20th century was largely a division, as we both know, on race, based on race. And of course, that's rooted in America's own slavery experiences, segregation, and so forth. Here, the dynamic in Washington has been much different, Blair. Would you give us a sense of how it affected these immigrants as they came into the city?
Well, I think Washington is a different and it's a harder case, and I think it's still an open question whether or not how much diversity capital is going to be created in Washington. But basically, you had, in the late 1960s, terrible divisions, and you had the riots of 1968, and you had a kind of gutting out of central Washington through a number of factors, some local, some we now understand are more generalizable. And it's exactly at that time that the immigrants begin to emerge and arrive in the Washington, D.C. area, and in Washington in particular. And if you go back to 1970, the percentage of foreign-born in the District of Columbia was in the low single digits, and today it's 13–15%. Now that in part has to do with the exodus of African Americans to the suburbs. During this period, the white population is relatively stable. The white population fell precipitously in the 50s and 60s, but it stabilizes the overall DC population, and at the same time there's an even more massive migration into the suburbs.
In fact, new types of living arrangements, I think, are created. The Edge City sort of arises during this period.
Well, one of the interesting phenomena which you see in all three cities is the importance of suburbanization. And the reason for that, I think, is that the suburbs didn't have the traditional lines that were drawn. It didn't have a St. Lawrence Boulevard or a 16th Street. Basically, developers, be they the Soviet state in Kiev or private developers in Montreal and Washington, they were about selling or fulfilling their plan for building housing and getting people to live in it. And they didn't really much care who it
who
was.
lived there.
And so that the suburbs actually blur a lot of boundaries that had been in place before. And I think that's an interesting part of the story.
Yes, just as in Montreal, that blurring also occurred. I thought that was very striking. Blair, there's another interesting element, and this tends to the political end of the spectrum that's going on as these new immigrants, who also are largely from Latin America and Africa, and places that traditionally hadn't sent great numbers of people. But they're also arriving at a point, I took it, in which Washington's own political dialogue is changing, political dynamic is changing somewhat. That is to say, this city has traditionally been, or at least historically had, what you called sort of civil rights era politics in its governance. And this has begun to shift in the direction of more practical and pragmatic expressions. Now, is that affected by these immigrants?
I think it's affected indirectly by the immigrants. It's not as in the case of Montreal, where you can see Washington politicians playing for the immigrant vote. But I think it really changed the meaning, their presence changed the meaning of government in the District of Columbia. Home rule in the District of Columbia comes very, very late in the 1970s and is part of the civil rights agenda. And it was as much a part of the civil rights agenda nationally as voting in Mississippi was. And therefore, quite naturally, it catapulted into power a group of politicians whose primary concern was over a civil rights agenda.
Right.
And you get into the 1990s and a number of processes happen. One, you have the collapse of the district government. It is put in a sense receivership by Congress. Secondly, you have taking place in all three cities the impact of globalization, where cities begin to compete economically in ways in which they didn't before. So your bond rating becomes much more important, and that already puts a premium on kind of pragmatic politics, and we see that in all three cities. But the other thing that happens is you have a replacement of the civil rights generation by a generation of largely neighborhood politicians who make their way up through neighborhood organizations, and what they're about is making sure the garbage is picked up on time and the streets are clean, and part of the agenda then becomes the demands of immigrants to make the system work.
Has this Washington become a very different city as a result of all of that?
Well, Washington is a much different city in ways in which I think people have yet to fully grasp. And when it becomes visible, people are taken aback. And I think the politics over the baseball stadium in Washington kind of caught people unaware. Was who is the city council? Well, the city council have been transformed by the changes I was just talking about. And they really are paying attention to how much does this cost. And suddenly you had a city council that's at odds with the mayor, that's trying to exert its authority, and it's a very different political equation. And I think Washington, because the weight of history here is so strong, we often fail to comprehend what a different city it is now from what it was in the past.
That's right.
And some people who understand it don't like it, which is also understandable.
And where it may yet go, because I think, as you mentioned, Montreal has become a city that's multicultural based in its sort of French-English.
Well, I think the real challenge in Washington is how to come to terms with this new diversity without losing sight of the African-American contribution and the meaning of the African-American community to the history of the city, because you can't, we're sitting in central Washington on land that was farmed by black slaves before the nation's capital was here. African-Americans have been part of the very texture of the city from the beginning. And one of the more disturbing aspects of the rhetoric about immigrants in Washington is it's almost as if, well, they kind of erase all of that history. And that's not what I'm saying. They have to somehow become part of that history.
Right.
And that's really, I think, the more positive side of the story in Montreal.
And that seems to me to be, in essence, the creativity possible in diversity capital, as we're speaking of it. Blair, I found Kiev to be, in many ways, obviously a very intriguing case, but one that I thought was perhaps, in a sense, the newest, if you will. It seems to me that there the variables are quite different. It's kind of, I thought it was a sense of a city and a country trying to decide its post-Soviet identity as it begins to receive these perhaps unexpected numbers of unexpected people from far-off places.
Well, you know, Ukraine is very interesting because we talk about Washingtonians not understanding what's going on. Ukraine is really being caught by surprise. The UN very recently released a report on the major immigrant countries in the world. The United States is first, Russia is second, Germany is third, Ukraine is fourth.
I'd never have guessed
People
that.
would never, and Russians and Ukrainians wouldn't guess that. Now, there's a little bit of a trick here because this has to do with foreign-born, and a lot of the foreign-born are former Soviet citizens. But still, Kiev is, and Moscow more so, these are cities that are becoming major immigrant hubs. And the local population isn't really thinking about that at all. And that creates all sorts of very particular challenges. And where the studies, I already alluded to the fact it started in Kiev. I think the question is does Kiev fit into this group of cities or not? And I think
the question's
time
open.
will tell.
There's some very interesting things, though, about the immigrant community in this fourth largest recipient nation, which I still am quite...
It's stunning.
It is stunning indeed. But they seem to be extremely entrepreneurial. That struck me, first of all. The Afghan community and others, Chinese, Vietnamese, and so forth. And then secondly, perhaps even more strikingly, Blair, I was struck by the role of the schools and the fact that the fate of the children of these immigrants in that city seems to be so much, well, perhaps promising, certainly different than that of their parents.
Well, in part because we literally stumbled upon this issue through the schools. I may have a bit more optimistic take on what's going on in Kiev than many people do. When I talk about this, people usually say, Kiev, well, don't you know everybody hates immigrants and so on and so forth. Actually, in our surveys, we did surveys of immigrant communities and of the indigenous Kiev community, immigrants talk about what a nice place it is to be, except for African immigrants. The African community very much feels the sting of racism. But the largest community is Afghan. There's a very large Kurdish community. There are now growing communities from the Caucasus. And the immigrants themselves report a kind of civility in their interaction, which, given the fact that many of these people are coming from war zones, they very much appreciate.
One thing I would point out, though, about the immigrants in Kiev in particular, they seem to have a large percentage of people in transit, so to speak, that might be moving on yet to...
There is, in our surveys, it varies from community to community. Kurds, for example, are looking at Ukraine as their home. Afghans are looking to move into Europe, but when we began to press on specific plans, they're really very low. And plus, it is relatively easy to become Ukrainian citizens. So there are a number of Afghans now. Indeed, for the last 3 years, more people have become Ukrainian citizens than have relinquished Ukrainian citizenship. And these are largely some of the groups we're talking about, Afghans in particular. So, as always, there's this myth that everybody's going to move on. Well, maybe they will. And this is why I use this term transnational rather than immigrants. But somebody else is going to show up. And life gets in the way, and people who have plans to move on often don't, and you really see that in a place like Kiev.
This is a fluid, creative situation, I think, in every sense.
Exactly.
Everything's in flux, but it can be in flux positively. Blair, I want to hold up your book again and point to the cover, obviously, because I think this cover tells a tale in itself. I'd like you to give us at least a moment's description of what we're looking at here. This, by the way, is taken, I take it, at the St. Patrick's Day.
St. Patrick's Day Parade in Montreal in 2000.
One of the oldest and most cosmopolitan in the world.
It is the oldest and one of the largest. It far predates any St. Patrick's Day Parade in the United States. And in 2003, a Nigerian-Irish woman who's a student at McGill was crowned the queen of the St. Patrick's Day Parade. And I think that is the story that I'm trying to tell.
Right. Her name is Tara Heckscher, is that correct?
That's
and
correct.
She's, of course, right here in the middle very attractively with her princesses.
Smiling away.
Smiling away.
Yeah.
Among the many things you learn in this book is that parade itself is one of the oldest and most cosmopolitan.
Well, one of the interesting things about the St. Patrick's Day Parade, first off, it's in March in Montreal, so it's a reason to celebrate. We shouldn't forget the role of weather here. It's spring. But it has become, evolved into a celebration of Montreal's cosmopolitan nature. And the Irish organizations who run the parade are very proud of that, which is one reason they've had an Inuit Irish queen, Quebecois Irish queens, Nigerian, and they're very much aware of the special function the parade has played.
I'm so glad you used that for the cover, that you included it in the book and told us about it here, because I think it's a perfect example and as in vignette form of what we can hope for in these cities. And maybe that brings us very nicely, Blair, to the concluding question of this conversation. Throughout our conversation, throughout my reading of this book, I've been struck by this comes down to a question of how the residents of the cities, political structures and citizens alike, look at this. I mean, what's their attitude toward this? It's going to determine how things work out. I'd like for you to give us your thoughts about, how cities can make this work positively. What's the secret?
Well, I think the secret is trying to structure the rules of the game so that people feel as if they have to interact in a way that is at least superficially tolerant. This is not about people loving one another. I have no idea what's in the hearts and minds of the people I write about. It's really about a behavior that makes the presence of different groups possible. And it's about structuring the rules of the game so that intolerant people understand they benefit from acting in a tolerant manner. It's not about changing their hearts. And I think you see that there's a very good example in Montreal where at the height of the Quebec separatist drive, Périzeau, who is the separatist premier of Quebec, took to the podium on the night of the defeat by the narrowest of margins. It was under 1% that the separatist referendum lost. And he was tired and he was probably drunk, and he talked about how the vote was stolen by the ethnics and by money. And in fact, it was. But it wasn't a statement of fact that got him dismissed. He was gone in 24 hours because it was a statement of intolerance. It's trying to make the structure of the game such so that intolerant behavior is not rewarded.
I think that's very well said, Blair. Thank you for that message.
Thank you, George.
And thank you for this book. And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHC Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhcworldview.org. And please join us again right here next week. And thank you for watching. And thank you, Blair.
Thank you, George.